name's Dave Hughes. I've been here in Pacific. I moved here in 1973, and here we are today in 2023. I can't believe where the time has gone, but I've been here for quite some time. To let you know a little bit about myself, I grew up in St. James, Missouri, which is a small town. And I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and it was a wonderful, wonderful time to be a young boy, where you could play baseball and ride bikes and go hunting and fishing, and people were so friendly, and everybody took care of everybody. But the problem with St. James was that I realized that there was no money to be made, so I knew that I couldn't spend the rest of my life there. But I went to high school there, and then I went to college at the University of Missouri at St. Louis. And I got out of college. I went to the military in between. You only had so long to get through college. I was a slow learner. And so I got drafted, and I went into the military. I became a section chief for the artillery. I was a buck sergeant, and I spent most of my time up on the DMZ in North Vietnam, where I was awarded the Bronze Star. And I was so glad to get out of there and get back into the States. I arrived here in, I think it was 71 or 72, and I finished my schooling up. And I'll never forget, I had a job offer in St. Louis, and it was a good job. I was going to be a teacher. I was teaching business. And I had a really good offer at a very nice school, and I was given serious consideration to signing the contract and working for this school district. But I had to go to work that evening, and I worked as a meat cutter. That's how I worked my way through college. I was a meat cutter. And I left work at about 5 o'clock that evening, and you know how the traffic can be in St. Louis at 5 o'clock. I'll never forget, I got to Lucas and Hunt, and I tried to make a left turn, and I was going from Lucas to Hunt to some street. I can't recall what it was now, but to make a left turn at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I sat there and sat there and sat there, and it was probably 10 minutes before I could actually make the left turn. And I said to myself, you know, I don't think I can live here. I need to find myself a job in a smaller community like I grew up in, a community which I feel real comfortable in. So I thought to myself, well, how am I going to do this? And the next day I said, well, I'm going to head west, and I'm going to start hitting all the small towns. I'll hit Eureka, Pacific, St. Clair, Sullivan, and then I'll go all the way to Springfield. Surely one of those small towns will pay a decent wage, and they will hire me as a business teacher. Well, I stopped at Eureka and put an application in, and we had a nice conversation. They said they were interested, but they didn't want me to sign a contract then. And so I went to Pacific, and I sat down at the high school with the principal. I think his name was Tipton. This was many years ago, and him and I hit it off, and he said, Dave, here's what we can offer you. I would like for you to sign. And I said, listen, that will be just fine. And he told me about the community there. We had a long talk. I remember one of the conversations was regarding the basketball teams there in Pacific. And I said, you know, when I was a boy in St. James and Pacific had a real rivalry there. And so I had gone to Pacific to watch the St. James Tigers play the Pacific Indians there. And at that time, this was in the 60s, you guys had a very good, Pacific had a very good team. So did St. James. Anyway, it was very entertaining there. But we had a nice conversation, and he hired me. And as soon as he hired me, I signed the contract, and I thought, now, I signed a contract making a whopping $7,200 a year. I knew that was not very much money, but I thought I could be happy here. But I knew that I was a journeyman meat cutter. At that time, that required a lot of skills. It took 2 years to become a journeyman. And so I went to a store. It was called Snyder's IGA. and I talked with Bob Snyder, who's passed away, a wonderful, wonderful man. All the Snyders were wonderful people. And I told him, I said, listen, Mr. Snyder, I'm a teacher. You're going to need somebody in the summertime to cut meat for you, so that people can take vacation and you won't get too far behind. And I told him I was very good, and I was an excellent meat cutter. At that time, it was a high skill because the beef would come in front quarters and hind quarters, and you had to break them down. Took a long time to learn that. And anyway, he said, Dave, he liked me, and I knew that right away, and I liked him. And he said, let's give it a try. And at that time, the journeyman meat cutters were making $17 an hour, which was a lot of money back in the 70s. And so between the meat cutting in the summer, taking care of vacations, and the teaching, I knew that I could make $12,000, which was okay. I wasn't going to get wealthy, but I knew that I would be comfortable there. And so that's how I got into Pacific, and I have enjoyed it much. Just a couple of stories about Pacific that I found as I was thinking about this interview. A couple of stories that I found somewhat interesting and entertaining to me was when I was a boy, somewhere along the line, my dad took a job in St. Louis. He lived in St. James, but he was building a house in St. James, but he worked in St. Louis at General Motors because there was no money in St. James. And he would drive back and forth. I had so much respect for that man. That was a 100-mile drive. But I can remember that when we lived in St. Louis, we would go every weekend out to St. James to work on the house and that sort of thing. And I remember coming through Pacific, and one time we stopped right near this building here. We went up on the cliffs, and they had an overview. They had a little old rock, I'm not sure what you call that, a rock area up there, and it was the most beautiful thing. And I was a little boy, and I looked out over that cliffs, and I said, oh, this is absolutely magnificent. And it made a real impression on me. And then the highway itself made an impression on me, because that's when Route 66 opened up. Before that, I'm thinking that the drive from St. James to the St. Louis area must have been just a two-lane highway, but when Route 66 opened up, you had highways going each way. And I remember them coming through Pacific. When you got into Pacific, you no longer had highways, dual highways, and so the traffic would get jammed up a little bit. But I remember going through the town, and one time I remember we were driving, my dad was driving an old Studebaker truck, and he had a blowout and tire, and he was hanging onto the wheel like this. It was vibrating, and he pulled over to an old Shell station right up the road here. It's no longer there, and got the tire fixed. Now, I don't know why that made an impression on me, but it did. But another impression that I had is they had a place called the Diamond Inns. Well, on the way from St. Louis to St. James, we would frequently stop at the Diamond Inns, not to get food or anything, not to get lunch or dinner. We didn't do that back then. That was a treat that you just never did. But I can remember they had a little area back to the end of the Diamonds there. They had an outside area where they sold popcorn and they sold peanuts. Now, when you got within 300 yards, you could smell that popcorn. I was a little boy, so my nose must have really been good. But I can remember smelling that popcorn, and I was so happy when Dad would pull in there, and he would get us a bag of popcorn to eat on the rest of the way from Pacific to St. James, and that made an impression on me there. And anyway, to continue my story here, once I started teaching, I had wonderful students back in the 70s and 80s and part of the 90s. Somewhere along the line, I ran into my wife. Her sister was in one of my classes, and her sister liked me. Her sister was very bright. And her sister said, Mr. Hughes, my sister would like to go out with you, and would you be interested? And I said, is she pretty? She said, yeah, she's a pretty one. So I said, okay then. So we went out, and I can remember we went to Joe's Pizzeria in Eureka. Now, that was over 40 years ago, and Joe's was there then, and it's still there. That's a place that you might want to visit one of these days. But they got great pizza. But anyway, we talked and we hit it off. Anyway, several years later, we got married, and my wife became a nurse. I was a teacher, and I was cutting meat, so we were making a pretty good living. And somewhere along the line, I was telling one of my students, it was in right around the 80s, that I was interested in purchasing a house in Pacific. Well, I got a call from her parent. They said, listen, I've got a house that I would like to sell, Mr. Hughes, and would you like to take a look at it? And I said, yes, I'll take a look at it. But I said, now, I've been saving, and I had like $12,000 saved up. But the interest rate at that time, this was when Jimmy Carter was president, the interest rate was 16%. And you had to put 20% down on a house. So there was no demand for a house. If you want to sell a house, it just sat there. So I said, I'd like to take a look at it. And he gave me the address. It was on 224 East Walnut. And I went there, and it's an old stone house, an old rock house. And on the outside, it looked like a dump, but I thought to myself, oh, this is going to be fantastic. I can make this thing beautiful. Walked inside, and it was run down, but I could see that it had so much potential. And then, as I was talking to the guy who wanted to sell it, my wife took me aside, and she said, Dave, she said, you know, I lived right up the road here. She's been in Pacific since she was a little girl. She's been born here. And she told me, she said, now listen, when I was a little girl, I would walk to school each day, and I would pass this house. And I said to myself, I would love to live in this house, because it's an unusual house. It's a rock house, and you don't see them anymore. And so we got to talking back and forth, and I picked the house up. I got it for $45,000. This was in 1982, and $45,000 was a lot of money back then. And I put everything I had down on it, and so my payments were like $700 a month. Now you got to understand, in 1972, $700 was a lot a month, and my wife and I said, I don't know how we're going to make this, because we had been married for a while, and we had 3 children, and so we had 3 boys, and so we went ahead and took care of it, signed the papers, we got the house, moved in, and I started working on it, and I have put tons of money into it and tons of sweat into it, and now it is a beautiful, beautiful house on the outside and on the inside. I'd love to show it to you if you want to come around. 224 East Walnut. And so anyway, we've been living in that house since '72, and here it is, 2023, and where has the time gone? I think I said we've been living here since '72. We moved in '82, so, but '82 to 2023, and you know, where has the time gone there? But anyway, I've loved the house. I love the community. I always, for years, parked my car just like I did in St. James, and I would just leave the keys in the ignition or throw them on the floor. I never locked the doors. I didn't start locking the doors until sometime in the 90s, whenever you kind of had some drugs coming in, and things kind of changed a little bit. So I just found Pacific to be an ideal place, because you had the small town atmosphere, and I had the small town atmosphere in Pacific, but if I wanted to, I I could drive a half hour and I could be in a big city. I could go to the Forest Park, I could go to a museum, I could go to a ballpark. Got all kinds of restaurants down there, got many things to do, but I could drive back from the city out to Pacific, and I was in a small rural town again, and I just find that people in these areas are some of the finest people in the world. These are Midwestern people, and these are fine people. These are the backbone of this country, and this is what makes the United States of America, which I love. I love this country. This is what makes the country great, is these people in these small communities. So now, I taught business education, mostly accounting, for a number of years, and then sometime in the late 80s, I think it was 89, I had an opportunity to open a company up in St. Louis. It was a rehab company where they evaluate people who get hurt at work. If somebody falls off a roof and hurts herself real badly, and I'm not talking about a small injury, I'm talking about these people being paralyzed and such, we would have some counselors who would evaluate this guy and see what kind of future he had, and how much it would cost to until he died, and if he could get a job, and these people a lot of times were people like, they were like roofers, you know, and so they would not have an education by and large, so we would try to get them in school and then get them into working with computers and get them a different career there. That business became very successful. And then in 97, my wife was a nurse and she was doing very well, but she wanted to open her own company up, and so we opened a case management company. My wife was the only employee besides me, and she would, as people, insurance companies would call us, the state of Missouri, people would call us when you had somebody who had a bad injury, and my wife knew the medical people all around St. Louis, and she would take these people and she would get them to the right doctors. You get them to the right doctors, and you get them back to work real quickly. You save the insurance companies a ton of money, and hopefully you keep the lawyers out of it. If you're a lawyer, you're watching this, I'm not bad-mouthing you, but you know how you guys are. So we try to keep the lawyers out of it. You plaintiff attorneys can be difficult to work with. So anyway, that company we started in 97, and we now have probably 50 employees, so we're doing very, very well. And so consequently, somewhere in the 90s, I was working two jobs. I was working the teaching, but I was also taking care of the finances for both companies. So I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'd do work, and I'd work until late at night. And then one day I said, I think these companies are going to make it. I don't have to do this. I'll get some other employees to do it. So now we got employees doing things, and I don't do nothing hardly, man. I go in on weekends. Or I go in during the week, and I go in and they say, hey, Mr. Hughes, how you doing? They get me a cup of coffee. So I'm drinking my coffee, man, and they're treating me so good, and I know they're hoping, I wish that old man would get out of here so we could go back to work, but they treat me very good, and anyway, I'm happy as can be with the way things have worked out. But the thing that I want to point out in this company, this nurse case management company, it's right up the road here, and we bought a house. It's at 115 East Osage, and it was a rundown house, but it's an old Queen Anne house, and the city of Pacific bought it from Dave Hoven, who was an attorney, and the city of Pacific bought it, and I think it was their intention to take this house and turn it into a museum. For whatever reason, that didn't work out. It just sat there, and the roof was leaking, and there was some damage in the place. But I went and checked it out. I heard it was for sale, so I went and talked to the mayor, and I went and checked the house out, and it had some damage to it. And I thought, well, I can go ahead and put some money in this thing here, and I can turn this into a beautiful office. And I could just visualize it in my mind here. but sometimes I ain't so good at visualizing things. But anyway, so I bought the house, and I bought it for $150,000, which was a good buy at that time. And I knew in my mind I needed another 150 to fix it up. Well, I'm not real bright. I had to put a new roof on it. It's kind of funny. So I went and priced getting a new roof, and they said, Dave, this roof is the type of roof. It's what is it? My mind's gone a little bit here. I'm an old man here, but it's a type of roof. Asbestos is the word I'm looking for. So they said, we got to tear this roof off, and it's asbestos. I said, it's asbestos. He said, yeah. I said, what's that mean? He said, well, it means it's going to cost you an arm and a leg, Dave. I said, oh, God. So here comes a crew to tear it off, and they got white outfits on, and they got white masks on and hoods on. And I said, oh, God. So they tore the roof off. And anyway, the guy was telling me the truth. He said, Dave's going to cost you an arm and a leg. You see this right here? Arm's gone, man. I'm telling you, they took it. But anyway, we put a new roof on, and when they tore the roof off, this is an old house that was built before the turn of the century, I think. And the roof had a board, space, board, space, board, space, and it had the old square nails that were made by hand. And so they had to tear the whole roof off. And then they, to repair that and put new shingles up there, it was quite an ordeal. And then I had to get somebody to come in and do some work on the inside, it wasn't terrible inside, but it required some work. And then I had to work on the outside. The outside was just, it was bad. We had to scrape the whole thing, put new paint on. And I had a number of individuals in town say, Dave, why don't you take, instead of scraping that house and painting it, just put new siding on there? And I told them, I said, if you put new siding on that, it will look okay, but you will lose something there. This is a historic place, and I wanted to make it look beautiful like it was when it was built. And so I had a crew out there, and they were scraping that paint, and they repainted the outside, and it turned out beautiful. And I had my office upstairs. If you see the house, it's on 115 East Osage. It's got that, it's a Queen Anne home. It's got that turret, like a castle. That was where my office, I love to go to work at my office. It was so nice to sit up there. And I got that room, and it was just, it was a great office to have. And anyway, after we got the house done, then I called up Hillerman's nursery, and I had it landscaped. And the reason I'm telling you this is maybe the proudest thing I've done. This is kind of my legacy. And I think when people come into town and they see that building, they just, it's beautiful. And they look at it and they go, oh my goodness gracious. So between that house, that's an office now, in between my house, which is a rock house, I've had people stop by. I had a guy not recently, he was from Indiana, and I was outside on the front porch, and he stopped and rolled the window down. He said, you know, I'm from out of state. He said, but every time I go to a town, I'd like to drive the neighborhoods, and I like to see the architecture. And he said, you have a beautiful house. My house and my office, I'm just so proud of them there. And I'm just so proud of this town right here. And I got so many wonderful memories. And I've lived here since 1972. I'm 76 now, so I don't know how much longer I got, but I will probably die here, I will die here, and I'll get buried here someplace. I don't know where yet. I haven't made those plans. Keep putting that off. I talked with God the other day, and I said, God, is there any way you can make an exception for me and not let me die? And he said, no, David, you're going to go. So anyway, that's where we're at there, and I just think that you people who are here at the museum looking at things, there's a lot of artifacts here, but if you drive around town, you get to see the old buildings, and you just got to go back in time if you can, and you can see the if you can go back in time in your brain here, you can see things like my stone house. Going to the garage, it didn't have a concrete driveway. It had two concrete slabs running from the street all the way to the garage, and that was for the Model T cars. And I had to break that up and put a new driveway in. And I really hated to do that because I knew what that driveway was for, but I had to do it because it was all busted up and everything. But if you can just take your mind and go back in time, go downtown, you can visualize what this place was like in the 1900s when you had horses, the 1920s when you had lots of cars, in 1940s when you had World War II, and on and on and on. The place is just, it's grown, and I'm not for sure sometimes if it's a small town anymore. It's grown so much. But anyway, I love this place. I've lived here most of my life, and I'm going to die here. And I think that's concludes my interview. So I hope you enjoyed this.